Let me tell you something before we go any further. The moment that destroyed everything I had built up to that point lasted exactly 43 seconds. I know because I've replayed it thousands of times, sometimes late at night when the apartment is quiet and the screens are dark and there's no algorithm running, no model to check, no report to finalize, just me and the memory of a room full of people laughing. 43 seconds. I counted once. I was standing at a podium in front of 200 people, and in the space of 43 seconds, a 17-year-old boy with perfect hair and his father's confidence dismantled a year and a half of my life and made it sound like a joke. I want you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't the laughter that broke me. People laugh. People are cruel in crowds in ways they would never be alone. What broke me, what I carried for years like a stone sewn into my chest, was how fast everyone else agreed, how quickly 200 people decided that the loud, confident voice was more credible than the quiet one, how completely a single dismissive question can rearrange the way a room full of adults thinks about you. But here's what none of those people knew. What I barely knew myself, standing there with my throat going dry and my notes shaking in my hands. I was right. I had been right from the beginning. The model worked. The signal was real. And the boy who laughed the loudest at me that day would spend the next 15 years building an empire on foundations I had already calculated were rotten. He just didn't know I had the data. And by the time he found out, by the time he walked into my office in downtown Chicago and saw me sitting behind a desk that cost more than his first car, it was already too late. This is the story of how I got there, and I want to warn you right now. It is not a story about victory. It's a story about what victory costs, what it takes out of you, what you find when you finally reach the end of a 15-year project and realize that the boy who started it, the quiet, obsessive, pattern-hungry kid at that podium, is someone you barely recognize anymore. So if you're ready for that kind of story, stay with me, because it starts a long time before that podium. It starts in the back row of a 7th grade math class in Evanston, Illinois, when I was 12 years old and a teacher named Mrs. Bradford drew a supply and demand graph on the chalkboard, and something clicked inside my head that has never stopped clicking since. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I was. I was the kind of kid who existed in the background, not invisible, just quiet in the way that doesn't disturb people, the way furniture is quiet, present, but not demanding attention. I had 2 friends through most of middle school, both of them similarly interior people, and we ate lunch together at a table near the windows because none of us had ever successfully navigated the social architecture of the cafeteria's center section. I wasn't unpopular exactly. I just wasn't in circulation. People at my school existed on a kind of social currency exchange. They traded jokes, sports statistics, gossip, fashion signals, and I had nothing to offer in that particular market. What I had instead was this. I could see how things connected. I don't mean that in a mystical sense. I'm not talking about intuition or special gifts. I mean literally, mechanically, I could look at a system, any system, and track the relationships between its moving parts. My mother noticed it first when I was about 8. She said I was the only child she'd ever seen who would finish a jigsaw puzzle and then immediately flip all the pieces face down and do it again using only shape, just to understand it differently. I didn't know that was unusual. It just seemed like the more interesting version of the same puzzle. By 11, I was reading my father's business magazines, not because I understood everything in them, but because the charts fascinated me. Bar graphs, trend lines, scatter plots. They were visual arguments, compressed stories about money and time, and I could feel the logic in them even when I didn't have the vocabulary to articulate what I was seeing. My father worked in commercial insurance, and he brought those magazines home, the way other fathers bring home newspapers, and I absorbed them the way other kids absorbed comic books. Mrs. Bradford's supply and demand graph was different, though. That was the first time I saw an economic relationship rendered as a pure system. Inputs, outputs, pressures, equilibria. She drew it in about 3 minutes and moved on, but I stayed with it for weeks. I drew my own versions in my notebooks. I started changing the variables. What if demand didn't drop linearly? What if it collapsed suddenly at a threshold? What would that look like? What would that predict? I was 12 years old, asking myself questions that I wouldn't find formal answers to until my second year of college. That gap between the question and the answer, between the instinct and the language, that gap was where I lived for most of my adolescence. Harrington Academy was a private school in a suburb north of Chicago. Not the most elite school in the area, but serious, the kind of institution that had its own endowment, its own alumni network, its own mythology about the kinds of students it produced. My parents sacrificed a significant amount to send me there. I knew that. My father worked longer hours the year I started, and my mother stopped buying new clothes, and neither of them ever said a word about it directly, but I understood. The school had about 400 students in the high school division. The hallways were wide, and the classrooms had new equipment, and the teachers were, on average, genuinely excellent. I had a history teacher named Mr. Shelton who assigned primary sources instead of textbook summaries, and an English teacher named Miss Pierce who pushed us to argue ideas rather than summarize them. These were the first adults outside my family who seemed to take my thinking seriously, who would stop during class and actually engage with a question I'd asked, rather than rerouting to the prepared lesson. But the social world of Harrington Academy was its own separate curriculum, and I was failing it completely. The hierarchy was established within the first week of freshman year, the way hierarchies always establish themselves in compressed social environments, through displays of confidence, visible relationships, demonstrated access to resources, who you sat with at lunch, who you walked with between classes, who laughed at your jokes. These were the metrics that mattered, and I had none of the intuition for them. I understood systems. I did not understand people in groups. The person at the top of that hierarchy was a junior named Trevor Harrington. I want to be careful how I describe Trevor, because it's easy to make this kind of story into a simple morality tale with a cartoon villain, and that's not what Trevor was. He was genuinely magnetic. Tall, athletic, without being meat-headed, funny in the sharp way that people mistake for intelligence. He had his father's ease in rooms, that particular confidence of people who have never had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. He walked through Harrington Academy like he'd built it, and, in a sense, his family had. Victor Harrington was one of the school's largest donors, a fact that was never explicitly stated, but was understood by everyone, from the principal to the freshman who'd been there 1 week. Trevor was not a bully in the classic sense. He didn't push kids into lockers or steal lunch money. His cruelty was more sophisticated than that, and consequently more durable. It was the cruelty of social exclusion performed, with a smile. The well-timed comment that made a room laugh at someone who couldn't laugh back. The question designed to expose rather than inquire. He understood social dynamics the way I understood graphs, and he wielded that understanding with precision. He and I never had a direct conflict during my freshman and sophomore years. I was too far below the social altitude where he operated for our paths to meaningfully cross. I was aware of him the way you're aware of weather. Something large and influential happening at a remove, not directly threatening, but worth monitoring. What I was focused on instead was the problem I'd been sitting with since 8th grade. It started with a newspaper article. One of those long financial features that runs on a Sunday, the kind with charts and sidebars and pull quotes from analysts. This one was about a retail chain that had filed for bankruptcy, a company that had, 2 years before the collapse, been described by most analysts as a solid, reliable enterprise. The article was doing a retrospective. How had no one seen this coming? Where were the warning signs? I read that article 4 times, and the thing that struck me, the thing that lodged in my brain and wouldn't leave, was that the warning signs were there. The article even listed them, scattered through the narrative almost apologetically, as if embarrassed to admit they'd been visible all along. Declining same-store sales, rising debt-to-equity ratios, lease obligations that outpaced revenue growth, employee turnover in management positions. supplier payment delays. None of these things individually would have triggered an alarm, but together, in sequence, in relationship to each other, they told a story, a clear, readable, predictive story. Why hadn't anyone read it? I started keeping a notebook. Not a diary, I mean a working notebook, the kind engineers keep, full of observations and hypotheses and calculations. I started tracking companies the way a birdwatcher tracks migrations, not with emotional investment, but with the focused attention of someone cataloging patterns. I followed earnings reports, debt filings, management announcements. I built my own crude rating system in a composition notebook, a set of signals I thought might indicate early-stage corporate stress. This was freshman and sophomore year. I was doing this in my spare time, after homework, sometimes instead of homework, in the corner of my bedroom with a calculator and a stack of printed quarterly reports. My parents thought it was an unusual hobby. My father occasionally glanced at my notebooks with the cautious expression of someone who doesn't want to discourage something but also isn't sure it's healthy. My mother just made sure I was eating. By the spring of sophomore year, I had something I hadn't anticipated, a track record. 3 of the companies I'd flagged as high risk in my notebook had shown significant distress within 6 to 18 months of my notes. 2 others had gone into bankruptcy proceedings. I hadn't predicted timelines exactly. My methodology wasn't sophisticated enough for that, but the directional calls had been right. Something in the combination of signals I was watching was genuinely predictive. I went to Mr. Shelton after school one afternoon and showed him the notebook. He spent 20 minutes with it, turning pages, going back, asking questions. Then he looked at me over the top of the notebook with an expression I had never seen an adult direct at me before. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "About 1.5 years," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should enter this in the science conference." Harrington Academy's annual Science and Innovation Conference was a serious event. Serious enough that it sent entries to regional and then national competitions. Serious enough that university admission offices paid attention to it. Serious enough that the school brought in sponsors, local business figures, a few alumni in tech and finance, to serve as judges and audience members. I spent the summer between sophomore and junior year rebuilding the model from scratch, not because what I had was wrong, but because I knew it wasn't good enough. The notebook was intuition made visible, but it wasn't a system. Not yet. I needed to formalize the variables, establish the weighting between signals, build something that could be tested rigorously and explained clearly. I taught myself basic econometrics from a textbook I found at the public library. I learned the rudiments of regression analysis. I borrowed my cousin's old laptop and started building the model in spreadsheet software because I didn't have programming skills yet, and I worked with what I had. The model had 7 primary variables by the time I was done: debt service coverage, management turnover rates, supplier payment velocity, same store, performance trends against sector averages, inventory to revenue ratios, credit facility utilization, and a composite I developed myself that I called operational signal divergence, which measured the gap between what a company's public communications said and what its financial filings showed. That last variable was the one I was most proud of. It was the one that made the model actually work. I back-tested it against 43 corporate collapses over the previous 15 years. In 37 of those cases, the model had generated clear warning signals at least 14 months before the collapse became visible in the market. 37 out of 43. An 86% hit rate. I ran those numbers so many times that summer that I could have recited them in my sleep. I wasn't naive enough to think the model was perfect. I knew the 6 misses were meaningful, and I built them into the presentation. But the signal was real. I had built something that worked. Mr. Shelton helped me prepare the presentation. Ms. Pierce helped me with the writing. A math teacher named Mr. Cooper reviewed my statistical methodology and told me my regression approach was surprisingly sound for someone without formal training, which I think was meant as a compliment. By the time October came and the conference date arrived, I had been working on this project for over a year and a half. I knew the material so completely that I could answer questions from any direction. I had stress-tested the model against counter-arguments I'd generated myself. I was prepared. I was also 17 years old, standing in front of 200 people, and I had never given a public presentation before in my life. The conference was held in the school's main auditorium, a room with wood paneling and good acoustics and seating for exactly 212 people. I stood backstage and counted the rows from the wing entrance and did the math automatically, which is what I do when I'm nervous. I calculate things. There were 12 other student presentations that day. A junior named Bethany Shelton, no relation to my teacher, presented a biology project about antibiotic resistance in soil bacteria that was genuinely impressive. A sophomore named Nolan Bradford did something with photovoltaic efficiency that I didn't fully understand, but that the engineering sponsor seemed excited about. I was 11th on the program. I had chosen the slot myself, reasoning that attention in an audience tends to peak early and then drop, recovering slightly near the end of a session. I wanted the recovery peak, not the early enthusiasm that fades. This was the kind of calculation I made automatically. It didn't help my nerves, but it gave me the comfort of feeling like I'd controlled something. When they called my name, I walked out to the podium. The room was fuller than I'd expected. Parents had arrived. The sponsors, 6 or 7 local business figures in suits, were seated in a reserved section near the center aisle. Principal Monroe was in the front row with the school board liaison, a woman named Ms. Adrienne Hayes, who I recognized from her occasional appearances at school events. In the back of the auditorium, students who had already presented or who were waiting to present sat in a loose cluster. I could see Trevor Harrington in that cluster, leaning back in his seat with his ankles crossed, the posture of someone at perfect ease. He was there because one of his friends was presenting, I assumed, or because his father was one of the sponsors. Victor Harrington was indeed seated in the sponsor section, a large man with the specific kind of stillness that very powerful people sometimes have. The stillness of someone who doesn't need to perform attention because the room performs it for them. I set up my materials, I took a breath, and I started talking. For the first 20 minutes, it went well, better than well. I found a rhythm. Early, the rhythm of explaining something I genuinely understood and loved. The pleasure of walking someone else through a system and watching them track the logic. I saw teachers nodding. I saw one of the sponsors leaning forward. Ms. Hayes was taking notes, which I hadn't expected. I walked them through the 7 variables. I showed them the back-testing results. I explained operational signal divergence and watched the room's expression shift in real time as the concept landed. That particular look that crosses people's faces when something counterintuitive suddenly makes sense. I was building to the part I was most proud of. A live example. A currently trading company that my model was flagging as high risk right now, with the specific signals that were driving the assessment. I was 30 seconds into that section when Trevor Harrington stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't wait for a question period. He just stood up from his chair near the back of the room and said in a voice calibrated exactly for the acoustics of that auditorium, "So you're telling us a high school student can predict the economy better than professional analysts?" The laughter came immediately. Not everyone, maybe a third of the room, but the laughter that came was the infectious kind, the kind that signals permission, that tells everyone else it's safe to find this funny. I saw it ripple from the student section toward the center of the room like a wave. I tried to respond. I said something about the model being specifically focused on early distress signals rather than broad market prediction, which was accurate and relevant, but which came out too fast, too defensive, too technically dense for a room that was still half laughing. Trevor nodded slowly, performing consideration, then, "Right, but companies this large have entire departments of analysts with 30 years of experience, and Bloomberg terminals and proprietary data. You're using public filings and A spreadsheet. More laughter. Lighter this time. Uncomfortable, but still laughter. The model uses publicly available data by design, I said. One of the core findings is that the warning signals exist in the public record. They're just not being synthesized. And this operational signal divergence thing. He said the name with a slight emphasis that made it sound pretentious. How is that different from the sentiment analysis tools that quant firms have been using for a decade? I mean, my father's firm uses systems like this. This seems like it might overlap pretty significantly with existing proprietary research. That sentence was the grenade. He hadn't accused me of anything directly. He'd raised a question, a concerned, thoughtful-sounding question about potential overlap with existing research. In an auditorium full of adults who didn't have the technical background to evaluate the claim, who could only evaluate the confidence with which it was delivered, I watched the room shift. Not all at once. It was subtle, like a slow tide. The forward-leaning sponsor sat back. The note-taking slowed. Principal Monroe's expression changed in a way I couldn't fully read from the podium, but recognized instinctively as trouble. I tried to explain the differences between my approach and existing sentiment analysis. I had actually thought about this. I had a section in my presentation that addressed exactly this comparison, coming up in 3 slides. But the question had arrived out of sequence. The room's attention had fractured, and I was trying to answer a technical argument, while also managing the social reality that the room was no longer on my side. I failed at both. The rest of my presentation was 15 minutes of gradually diminishing returns. I got through my material. I answered 3 more questions from Trevor, each one a variation on the same theme. This work might not be original, this approach might be derivative. He never said anything false. He just kept suggesting possibility without evidence and letting the audience's anxiety do the rest. When I stepped down from the podium, the applause was polite. It was the sound of an audience that had been uncertain about what to feel and had settled on neutral. I stood backstage for a moment, holding my materials, and I remember thinking, the model is still right. All of this is noise. The model is still right. I didn't know yet what the noise would cost me. The first thing that happened was quiet, a brief conversation 2 days after the conference, between Mr. Shelton and the conference committee chair. I wasn't in that conversation, but Mr. Shelton told me about it afterward, his voice careful and flat in a way I hadn't heard from him before. The committee had concerns about the originality of the project, given the questions raised during the presentation, and given that one of the school's major sponsors had informally expressed similar concerns. The committee felt it would be prudent to hold the project's national competition entry, pending a review of potential overlap with existing research. The review never happened. There was no formal process, no specific accusation, no evidence presented. The project was simply held, and the holding became permanent, and the national entry slot went to Nolan Bradford's photovoltaic efficiency project. I want you to think about what that means for a moment. There was no evidence. There was no investigation. There was no due process. A 17-year-old kid with his father's money and his father's confidence made a suggestion in a room full of people, and that suggestion, with nothing behind it except the volume of its delivery and the prestige of its source, was enough to make an institution flinch. Tell me, what would you have done in my position? I want you to genuinely think about that. Because I've asked myself that question for 15 years, and I still don't know if there was a right answer. Put in the comments what you would have done, because what I did and what I didn't do shaped everything that came after. What I did was nothing. I didn't fight it. I didn't demand a formal review. I didn't go to my parents and ask them to push back. I was 17, I was stunned, and I had the particular paralysis that quiet people get when the social world suddenly turns loud and hostile. I retreated. I went home. I worked on the model. But the story wasn't done, because whatever Trevor Harrington had set in motion had developed a momentum of its own. Within a week of the conference, the rumors had spread through the school. The mechanism of high school rumor is fascinating and terrible. It's a telephone game played at the speed of text messages, and by the time a story has traveled through 3 or 4 social groups, it has transformed completely while feeling completely true. By the time the rumor reached my social orbit, it had become simple and devastating. The algorithm project had been copied from a research database. The kid had plagiarized his whole science project. No one said this to my face. That wasn't how it worked. It existed in the atmosphere around me, in the conversations that went slightly quiet when I walked up, in the look teachers gave me that was almost imperceptibly different from before, something between sympathy and wariness, in the way the 2 college admissions counselors who had reached out to me after learning about my conference entry both sent nearly identical emails within the same week, saying they appreciated my interest, but they were refocusing their recruitment priorities. That last part hit me hardest. I had spent 6 months corresponding with an admissions officer at the University of Michigan who had heard about my project through an alumni connection and had indicated real interest in early admission. That email came on a Tuesday morning. I read it 3 times before I understood what it was actually saying. The scholarship inquiries dried up simultaneously. I had been in contact with 3 merit-based scholarship programs that offered significant funding for STEM-focused students. All 3 went quiet within the same 2-week window after the conference. 1 formally declined. 2 simply stopped responding. I'm telling you this so you understand the full architecture of what was dismantled. It wasn't just the science conference entry. It was the entire structure that the science conference entry was supposed to be a foundation for. The model, the project, the 1.5 years of work, it was supposed to be the beginning of something. Instead, it became a door that closed. My father sat across from me at the kitchen table one Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the conference, and he had a look on his face that I had never seen before. It was the look of a man trying very hard not to show that he is frightened. He asked me carefully, gently, if there was anything about the project I wanted to tell him, if there was any part of it that had drawn on other people's work. I told him no. I told him exactly what I had built and how and when. He listened. He believed me, I think. Or he wanted to believe me. But I could see him calculating the cost of a formal dispute with the Harrington family, a family that had the school's administration in its donor roster, and the kind of legal resources that make disputes expensive regardless of who's right. He didn't push back either. I don't blame him for that. He was a man with limited resources trying to protect his family, and picking a fight with the Harringtons over a science competition had a very uncertain upside. But that conversation, the way he looked at me with that particular mixture of belief and resignation, that was the moment I understood something fundamental about power that no economic model had taught me. Power doesn't need to be right. Power just needs to make being right too expensive. I graduated from Harrington Academy in the spring, quietly, without distinction. My grades were still strong. I had never allowed my external circumstances to affect my academic performance, which was the one form of control I had left. But the social calculus of the school had shifted permanently. I was the kid with the plagiarism rumor, regardless of what anyone actually believed. That kind of story, once it enters the atmosphere of an institution, doesn't leave. I enrolled at a state university, not a bad school, a genuinely good school, in fact, with a strong economics department and faculty who had done real work. But it was not what I had been building toward. It was not the outcome I had imagined when I spent my summer building regression models in a spreadsheet program on a borrowed laptop. I remember driving to campus with my parents in August, my dorm stuff in the back of the car, and watching the highway pass, and thinking, this is not where the story ends. This is where it adjusts. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because I think people misunderstand what happened next. This is not a story about a young man with iron determination who drives to college with a beautiful plan for how he's going to prove everyone wrong. That's the movie version. The real version is messier and quieter and more confused. I drove to campus, and I was 18 years old, and I had no plan. I had a working model that I believed in, a wound I didn't know how to process, and the same obsessive instinct that had built the model in the first place. The plan came later, slowly, from the work itself. That's how real things actually develop. Let me tell you what those first months after Harrington Academy were like, because I think most people skip over this part when they tell their own versions of this kind of story. The skip is understandable. This part doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't feel like building. It feels like sitting very still in a room and waiting for the hurt to stop. But the sitting still was real, and the hurt was real, and I think you need to understand both before you can understand what came after. I spent most of that summer before college alone. My 2 friends from high school had scattered, one to a school in Boston, one to a program in California, and I had not cultivated the kind of broad social network that would have given me a community to return to. I worked a part-time job at a local copy center 3 days a week, which gave me $8 an hour and something to do with my hands. The other days I spent at home, running the model. I want to be careful how I describe this period, because it would be easy to frame it as suffering, and that's not quite right. I was not actively miserable. I was numb in the specific way that follows a significant loss. You go through the days, and the days have their textures and their small events, but underneath everything there is a persistent blankness, a sense that something has gone out of the picture that used to give it dimension. What I had lost wasn't the science conference prize. What I had lost was the narrative I had built around myself. The quiet kid in the back row who has something real, who is building something genuine, who will eventually be seen for what he actually is. That narrative had been the scaffolding of my self-concept, and it had been dismantled in 43 seconds, and without it I wasn't sure what was holding the rest up. I kept working on the model because the model didn't know any of that. The model didn't know about Trevor Harrington or the conference or the scholarship emails. The model just had data and hypotheses and the relentless demand to be tested against reality. That indifference was a kind of comfort. I could go to the model on any day, regardless of how the day felt, and the model would respond the same way. Here is what the data shows. Here is what it predicted. Here is whether the prediction held. The model was the most reliable thing in my life. I held on to it accordingly. My first year at college was an education in how completely I had been operating outside my actual intellectual level. I don't say that with arrogance. I say it with the specific shock of someone who has been building things alone in a room, and then suddenly walks into a large institution where people have been building things for decades, with real tools and real literature and real theoretical frameworks. My autodidactic model building had produced something genuinely interesting, but it had also produced enormous gaps. I didn't know the literature. I didn't have the mathematical foundation. My statistical training was a collection of specific techniques I'd taught myself, floating in a vacuum without the theoretical scaffolding that would have made them much more powerful. College gave me that scaffolding. I took every economics course available and stayed after for office hours. I took statistics courses intended for graduate students and convinced professors to let me audit seminars I wasn't enrolled in. I found, in my second semester, a professor in the economics department named Dr. Leonard Monroe, no relation to the principal, just the same last name, who worked on financial fragility theory and who had spent 20 years developing mathematical models of systemic risk in corporate markets. I want to tell you about Dr. Monroe carefully, because he matters a great deal to this story. He was a small man, slightly older than my father, with the manner of someone who has spent decades thinking about problems, and consequently has very little patience for conversation that doesn't advance the thinking. He was not warm, exactly. He was rigorous in a way that felt almost like warmth, because at least it was honest. He took ideas seriously and consequently took you seriously if you brought real ideas. I showed him my model at the end of freshman year. I had cleaned it up significantly by then, rebuilt it in actual programming language, applied proper statistical methods, eliminated several variables that I'd determined were spurious through a semester of proper training. He took my printed summary and read it, standing in his office doorway. which I found slightly insulting until I realized he read everything standing in doorways, as if sitting down would imply more commitment than the material had yet earned. He looked up after 3 minutes and said, "Your operational signal divergence variable. How did you arrive at the weighting?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come to my research group, Thursdays at 4. That was it. No praise, no acknowledgement of the model's larger significance, no comment on my age or background. Just, come on Thursdays. I came every Thursday for 3 years. The Thursday research group was 4 graduate students and, occasionally, Dr. Monroe himself, working on various aspects of financial fragility modeling. I was the only undergraduate, which was awkward initially and then irrelevant as the work established its own hierarchy. What I learned in that room was how to do this properly. Not differently, properly. The instincts I had were valid, it turned out. The core insight that motivated the model was real and defensible, and Dr. Monroe told me, once in a way that I understood, was high praise from him, non-obvious. But instinct without methodology is not science, and what the Thursday group gave me was methodology. How to structure a hypothesis, how to test it rigorously, how to account for survivorship bias in historical backtesting, how to acknowledge the model's failure modes without undermining its value. I rebuilt the model twice during those 3 years. Each rebuild incorporated what I'd learned from the last version's weaknesses and from the theoretical literature that was rapidly expanding my understanding of what I was actually building. By junior year, the model had 12 variables instead of 7, a much more sophisticated handling of temporal signals, the way certain indicators become meaningful only in specific sequences, and a failure prediction horizon of 18 to 24 months, with a new accuracy rate of 91% against the extended historical dataset. I also started doing something I hadn't planned. I started writing. Not the model documentation. I mean analytical essays, opinion pieces. I started a blog in my sophomore year, anonymous at first, then gradually less so, where I published my analysis of companies I was watching, not predictions exactly, more like structural assessments. Here is what the data currently shows. Here is what these signals have historically indicated. Here is the sequence I'm watching. The blog had 12 readers for the first 6 months. Most of them were my college friends or people in Dr. Monroe's research group who found it through the department's informal network. It wasn't designed for an audience. It was designed for practice, for the discipline of explaining my thinking clearly enough that a reader who wasn't me could follow it. But in the spring of my junior year, one of those 12 readers forwarded a post to someone else, and that someone was a portfolio analyst at a small Chicago area investment firm called Grayson Capital Partners. His name was Curtis Monroe, different Monroe entirely, a coincidence that would strike me as funny later, and he called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was eating lunch in the library. He said he'd read my analysis of a retail sector company and thought it was, quote, unusually interesting, and he wanted to know if I had published other work. I had an entire archive. Curtis was 28, brilliant in a different way than I was, street smart about markets in the way that people who work in them every day develop, and he had the particular quality of intellectual honesty that is rarer in financial services than people imagine. He could be wrong without breaking. He could encounter an idea that challenged his existing model and engage it rather than dismiss it. We met for coffee that first week, and then we met again the following week. And by the third meeting, we had established a kind of working relationship that was neither mentorship nor partnership, but something in between. He began feeding me questions. Here is a company we're looking at. Here is what the public filings show. What does your model say? I ran the analysis and reported back, not formally. No contracts, no fees, just intellectual exchange. But the exchange was building something. In the fall of senior year, Curtis brought one of my analyses to a meeting with Grayson Capital's senior team and attributed it to a system we've been evaluating. The senior team asked for the full methodology. Curtis told them about me. I was invited to present the model to Grayson Capital Partners on a Thursday in November, 3 years and 1 month after Trevor Harrington stood up in an auditorium and made 200 people laugh. I was 21 years old. I wore the only sport coat I owned and took the train into the city. That presentation went very differently from the first one. The difference was not the material. The material had always been strong. The difference was the room. A room of 8 analysts and 2 partners who had spent decades evaluating financial models, who asked questions designed to probe the methodology rather than undermine the presenter, who knew the literature well enough to recognize what was new about what I was showing them. The questions went on for 2 hours, not because there were problems, because there was genuine interest. These were people who could see what I'd built and evaluate it accurately. By the time the meeting ended, both partners had asked to see additional documentation. The firm hired me 3 months later, not as an analyst. I hadn't graduated yet. As a research consultant, which was a role they created specifically because none of their existing titles fit what I was doing. I started part-time in January of my senior year and full-time after graduation in May. I want to be honest with you about what those first 3 years at Grayson Capital were like, because the story gets complicated here. The model was working consistently, verifiably in real time. Every quarter, the signals I identified were proving out. The 18 to 24-month horizon was holding. The firm began incorporating my analysis into their investment decisions in a meaningful way, but I was 21, then 22, then 23, at a firm where the average analyst had a decade of experience and an MBA and a network I hadn't begun to build. My ideas were taken seriously. I was not always taken seriously. There is a difference between those things, and navigating that difference was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, because the natural response when someone dismisses you while using your work is anger, and anger in professional environments destroys careers. I also made a second mistake that year, smaller but meaningful. I told someone at the firm, a senior analyst named Randall Whitmore, who had always been friendly toward me, about the high school conference. I told him the whole story: Trevor, the auditorium, the scholarships, the rumors. I don't know why I told him. Loneliness, probably. The specific loneliness of someone who has been carrying a story alone for 5 years and needs to set it down somewhere. He listened with apparent sympathy, and then, 3 months later, during a particularly contentious investment committee meeting where my analysis was being challenged, he said, casually, almost kindly, "You have to remember that there's sometimes a personal stake driving these kinds of aggressive contrarian positions." He didn't name the story. He didn't have to. The implication was there, hanging in the air, doing its work. It was the Harrington Auditorium in miniature, a suggestion, a question mark attached to my credibility, leveraged at the moment of maximum damage. I never told that story at work again. I learned what I should have learned in high school. Your wounds are information only for people who are equipped to handle them responsibly. Most people are not. Wounds are vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are leverage, and leverage in a competitive professional environment will be used. The lesson was an expensive one, and I absorbed it completely. I also began to understand something more structural about what had happened to me at 17, a pattern I would eventually find the language for years later. The system had not failed me accidentally. The system had done exactly what systems do. It had protected its equilibrium, which meant protecting the most powerful entity within it. Trevor Harrington's suggestion had activated the school's institutional risk avoidance response. And I, the lower status entity with no donor relationships and no family leverage, had been the natural point of release. The system hadn't been malicious, it had been structural, and that is, in some ways, more difficult to understand and more important to understand than simple malice. Understanding the structure didn't reduce the anger, but it gave me somewhere to put it. Anger at a structure is different from anger at a person. It's more patient, more methodical, more likely to find a leverage point rather than just a target. I started paying closer attention to structures. I made a significant mistake in my second year at the firm. There was a company, a mid-sized manufacturing firm, that my model had been flagging for 9 months. Clear signals, consistent pattern, multiple variables, converging. I had presented the analysis to the investment committee and recommended against taking a long position in the company's stock. The committee had been interested but hesitant. The company's surface-level numbers looked healthy, and one of the senior partners had a long relationship with the company's CFO. After 2 more months of the signal strengthening, I did something I had not been authorized to do. I contacted a financial journalist I had met at an industry conference and shared some of my analysis. Not proprietary firm data, but my own model's output, which I considered mine. The story ran 3 weeks later. It was cautious and properly sourced, but it mentioned the specific signals I'd identified, and the firm's name came up in the background research the journalist had done independently. The CEO of the manufacturing company called the firm. The senior partner, who had a relationship with the CFO, was furious. I had an extremely difficult conversation with both partners that I will not reproduce here, except to say that I understood by the end of it exactly how a junior person is supposed to operate within an institution, and that understanding was earned through genuine error, not through unfair treatment. I nearly lost the position. I didn't. Partly because my track record was strong enough that the partners were reluctant to lose the model along with me. Partly because the manufacturing company did show significant distress indicators 12 months later, and the firm's conservative position that my analysis had informed proved correct. But the near loss clarified something important. I could not build what I wanted to build inside someone else's institution. The model required a kind of autonomy that a consulting role within an existing firm would never provide. I started planning to leave. I spent 2 more years at Grayson Capital, working harder than I ever had, which is saying something significant given what I'd been doing for the previous 5 years. I was building 2 things simultaneously: the enhanced version of the model, which I had continued developing in my personal time, and the professional credibility and financial resources that would allow me to use it independently. I saved with the discipline of someone with a single goal. I built relationships with everyone at every level of the firm, not strategically in the cynical sense, just genuinely, because I had learned that institutions run on trust and trust runs on relationship. I presented my work at 2 industry conferences and published 3 papers in peer-reviewed finance journals, the kind of publications that establish professional standing in a way that a college blog could not. And I was watching, always, the wider market, running my model continuously, building the data set that would eventually become the foundation of something much larger. In the fall of the year I turned 26, I met a woman named Melanie Carlisle at an industry event. She was a corporate attorney who specialized in financial services compliance, and she had the quality I've always found most compelling in people. She could tell the difference between what someone was saying and what they actually meant. We talked for 3 hours at that event about regulatory frameworks and their effect on transparency in corporate reporting, which is not the most romantic conversation I've ever had, but it was the most honest. Melanie would eventually become both my business partner and my primary legal counsel in the company I built. I mention her here because she is part of the reason the company survived its early years, and because she understood what I was doing in a way that I don't think I fully understood myself at the time. She told me once, about a year into working together, that she could see 2 different motivations running in parallel in everything I did, and that they didn't quite fit together. One was the work itself, the genuine, deep pleasure I had always taken in building the model, in the intellectual problem of financial distress prediction, in the craft of the system. The other was something harder to name, something that had the shape of a debt being repaid. I knew what she meant. I just didn't know yet how much that second thing was driving the first. I founded Ellington Analytics in April of that year. The name was deliberate, a reference to nothing personal, just a name from a list that sounded professional and had an available domain name. I set up a small office in a building on the north side of Chicago, hired 2 data scientists I'd worked with at Grayson, and signed a consulting agreement with a mid-sized pension fund that Curtis Monroe, who had by then moved to a larger firm, helped broker. The first 12 months were hard in ways I had prepared for, and hard in ways I hadn't. The ways I had prepared for, building a client base from zero, is brutally slow. The ways I hadn't, running a company is entirely different from running a model. HR, legal compliance, lease negotiations, payroll, the 100 small crises that absorb time that you want to spend on the actual work. Melanie managed most of the structural complexity, which was the only reason we were still operational after 6 months. But the model kept working. 2 companies in our first-year watch list showed significant distress exactly within the predicted window. Both had been clients' portfolio holdings. Both clients increased their engagement with us significantly after those calls. By the end of the second year, we had 11 active clients. By the end of the third year, we had 23 clients, including 2 significant institutional investors, and the firm was generating enough revenue that I had hired a full research staff of 8 analysts. I want to describe something about those years that I think is important, and that is hard to articulate accurately. There was a quality of quiet to the work. I was 30 years old, I was building something I'd been building my entire life, and I was doing it in a way that felt like the truest version of what I was supposed to be doing. I wasn't wealthy, not yet, but I was operationally independent in a way I had never been before. The model was mine. The company was mine. The decisions were mine. When the work was right, it was right because I had made it right. And when it was wrong for reasons I could find and fix. And I was happy. I want you to understand that. In those years, building the company from those first 12 difficult months through to the point where it felt like a real institution, I was happy in the specific way that people are happy when they are doing the work they were built for. I almost forgot about Trevor Harrington entirely. The name came back into my awareness on a Thursday morning when I was reading through a financial industry newsletter, the kind of thing I skim quickly because most of it is noise, looking for signals. A short feature on a young Chicago area businessman who was building what the article called a new model for regional investment, combining private equity with operational consulting to acquire and improve mid-sized companies. The article was complimentary in the way that financial press is complimentary when someone is spending money on PR. It used words like visionary and instinctive and a natural feel for value creation. His name was Trevor Harrington. The feature included a photograph. He had filled out slightly from the version of himself I remembered, more solid, more expensive looking, the same ease, the same perfectly calibrated confidence. I read the article twice, then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled up his public financial records. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think this is the most important part of the story. More important than the confrontation, more important than the collapse. And it's the part that most people tell wrong. I did not decide to destroy Trevor Harrington's business empire. I saw something in the data. That's where it started. Not with revenge, not with a plan, with data. The companies he had acquired, when I examined their filings, showed a pattern I had seen before. Not fraud, nothing so dramatic. A pattern of financial engineering, of surface-level optimization masking structural weakness. Debt service loads that looked manageable in the current rate environment, but would not survive a significant rate increase. Operational cash flows that were consistently below what the EBITDA figures implied, suggesting aggressive accounting in how costs were allocated. Management turnover in operations roles that was much higher than the industry average. My model flagged it automatically. I hadn't put Trevor Harrington's companies in as specific targets. They were simply in the dataset I was continuously monitoring as part of my market coverage. The model flagged them. I looked at the flags, and I saw, with a clarity that was almost beautiful in its simplicity, that Trevor Harrington had built an empire on exactly the kind of foundations that I had spent 15 years learning to see through. I sat with that for a week. Just sat with it, running no additional analysis, making no decisions. I want you to understand what was happening in my head during that week, because it was not clean. It was not the cold, precise reckoning that a certain kind of story would tell you it was. It was a mess of feelings that I'm not particularly proud of. Satisfaction, yes. A specific sour satisfaction, and below that something harder and older. The 17-year-old standing at a podium with his notes shaking. Both of those things were present simultaneously, and I had to figure out which one was going to be in charge. Here's what I decided. I would treat this exactly as I treated every other company my model flagged. No more, no less. I would conduct the analysis with the same rigor, publish the findings with the same transparency, and let the market respond the way the market responds. I would not give the Harrington situation special treatment in either direction. I would not go easier because of the personal history. I would not go harder. I want you to think about whether you believe that, and I want you to think about whether it matters, whether the intention behind an analytically correct assessment changes anything about what the assessment does in the world. Put in the comments what you think about that, because it's a question I've never fully resolved. The strategic position began 6 months before I published anything. Here is what I did, and I want to be precise about the sequence, because the sequence matters. First, I commissioned a full independent audit of my model's output on the Harrington-connected companies, not because I doubted the model, but because I knew that when the reports came out, there would be scrutiny of the methodology and I needed the analysis to be invulnerable. I hired an external statistical review firm to validate my backtesting and my current case analysis. They spent 3 months on it. Their conclusion, the methodology was sound. Second, I began acquiring positions in the Harrington-connected companies. This requires explanation. The companies Trevor had built his empire through were, individually, not fraudulent. They were real businesses with real operations and real employees. The structural weaknesses I had identified were genuine, but not immediately visible. They were the kind of risks that become crises only when external conditions change. In a period of continued low interest rates and economic stability, these companies could have continued operating, even growing, for another 2 or 3 years. They were simply running much closer to the edge than their public presentation suggested. The reason I acquired positions was not to profit from their collapse. I need to be clear about this, because the mechanism looks predatory if you describe it simply. The reason I acquired positions was to have standing, to be a legitimate stakeholder in these companies as a major investor, which gave my subsequent analytical reports a credibility and a legal standing that they would not have had if I were simply a third-party commentator. When a significant institutional investor publishes a critical analysis of companies in which it holds positions, the analysis carries a different weight. It signals that the analyst has skin in the game, that the assessment is not purely speculative. It's a well-established mechanism in activist investing. I was adapting it for analytical purposes rather than governance purposes, but the logic was the same. My firm began acquiring positions in 3 of the companies most central to the Harrington investment structure over a period of 6 months, in amounts small enough individually to be unremarkable, but collectively significant. Melanie handled the legal architecture of the acquisitions with her usual precision. By the time I was ready to publish, we were one of the largest minority investors in 2 of the target companies. The reports came out in sequence, not all at once. That would have been theatrical, and theater was not what I was doing. Theatrical demolitions draw defenses and create sympathetic narratives around the target. What I was doing was clinical. The first report addressed debt service dynamics in the sector generally, not Trevor's companies specifically. It established the analytical framework and built my credibility as a voice worth listening to on this specific type of risk. The second report was more specific, a detailed examination of one company's operational cash flow dynamics relative to reported EBITDA using the publicly available data. It named the company. It did not name Trevor Harrington. The third report introduced the concept of what I called connected entity risk. the way that financial stress in a cluster of related businesses can be magnified when the businesses share capital structures and debt facilities. This was the structural analysis of the Harrington portfolio, still without naming Harrington directly. Each report was read in the investment community, debated, challenged, and, when events began confirming the analytical conclusions, revisited. Two of the companies I had identified as highest risk in the third report showed the exact cash flow compression I had projected within 4 months of publication. Investors who had positions in the Harrington portfolio began asking questions they hadn't been asking before. Lenders began reviewing their exposure. The rate environment, which had been stable during the period of the empire's construction, shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to apply the pressure that I had calculated was coming. Within 8 months, 3 of the 8 major companies in the Harrington portfolio had their credit ratings revised downward. 2 had their revolving credit facilities reduced. The total equity value of the portfolio, by my firm's conservative estimate, had declined by approximately 40% from its peak. Trevor Harrington's empire was not destroyed yet, but it was cracking in exactly the ways I had predicted, in exactly the sequence I had predicted, on approximately the timeline I had predicted. And then the phone call came. It was a Tuesday morning in October. My assistant told me that a Trevor Harrington was requesting an urgent meeting. I asked her to schedule it for Thursday. I want to describe that interval, Tuesday to Thursday, because it was not what you might expect. I did not spend those 2 days preparing a speech. I did not rehearse a confrontation or plan what I would say. I went to work. I ran the model. I had a board meeting on Wednesday about a new client engagement. I had dinner on Wednesday with Melanie and 2 other friends, and we talked about a documentary we'd all watched and about an upcoming election and about nothing particularly significant. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, if I'm being accurate, something closer to tired. The kind of tiredness that comes not from overwork, but from the recognition that something very long is almost over. I also felt something else, something I'm less comfortable naming, a faint, persistent guilt. Not about the reports. The reports were accurate and the analysis was sound, and I believe to this day that what I published was in the public interest, providing information that investors deserve to have. Not about the investment positions. Those were legal, transparent, and structured correctly, but about the original motivation, about the 17-year-old still living somewhere inside the 32-year-old analytical firm CEO, and about whether the fact of that motivation contaminated the work. I still don't have a clean answer to that. He arrived Thursday morning at 9:30. I had not seen him in 15 years. He had changed in the way that men in their 30s change. The edges slightly harder, the ease slightly effortful, the performance of confidence now requiring more energy than it used to. He was still handsome, still carried himself well, but there was something different in his eyes that I noticed when he came through the office door. He was afraid. Not of me specifically. I don't think he knew yet exactly who I was relative to his situation. He was afraid of the situation itself, the way powerful people are afraid when power starts to leave them. Not panicking, he was too controlled for that, but the specific fear of a man watching something large and structural shift beneath his feet. My assistant brought him to my office, and I stood to meet him, and I watched the moment of recognition cross his face. It was not instant. I had changed too, more than he had, I think. I was not the nervous, slight 17-year-old at the podium. I was a different version of that person, and the difference was significant enough that it took him a moment. And then he knew. I could see it. "I know you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. I gestured to the chair across my desk. He sat down. We talked for a while. He made his case, outlined what he wanted, suggested that the situation could be approached differently, that there might be a mutually beneficial resolution. He was not unintelligent. His arguments were coherent. He had clearly been briefed by advisors, and he understood the mechanics of what was happening, even if he hadn't understood until recently who was behind it. I let him finish. Then I did the one thing I had thought about since Tuesday, and it was this. I opened a drawer and took out a photograph. A printed photograph of the Harrington Academy Science Conference, taken by one of the school photographers. I was at the podium. You could see the audience. Somewhere in the back of the room, Trevor Harrington was in his chair. I placed it on the desk between us. He looked at it. His expression didn't change much, but something went very quiet in him. "You were the first person," I said, "who convinced everyone that my work meant nothing." I let that sit for a moment. "Today the market has decided to test yours." There was a long silence. Outside my office window, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October. Gray, cold, moving. The city didn't care about this conversation. The market didn't care about this conversation. The data was what it was. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Is there anything I can say that would change the direction of your reports?" "The reports follow the data," I said. "If the data changes, the reports will change." He left without a handshake. The collapse took approximately another 8 months. It didn't happen all at once. These things rarely do. It happened the way my model had predicted for 15 years. In sequence, in stages, each failure creating pressure that accelerated the next. Credit facilities withdrawn, acquisitions unwound. Partners who had built their own businesses in partnership with the Harrington structure began separating themselves with increasing urgency. Trevor's public persona managed the story for about 4 months. He was good at managing narratives, always had been, before the weight of the actual numbers became too large to spin. By the following spring, the investment empire was in formal restructuring. The businesses were sold off or dissolved. The empire that had been described as visionary and instinctive in that newsletter article was, in the precise financial sense, gone. I followed the coverage, not with triumph, but with the careful attention of a scientist watching a predicted experiment resolve. The model had called it. 18 months earlier, my system had identified the structural weakness, and 18 months later, the market had confirmed the analysis. That is the cleanest part of this story. The science worked. Everything else is complicated. Victor Harrington called me personally 2 weeks after the restructuring was announced. I expected him to be adversarial. He was a powerful man, and powerful men generally don't respond well to the kind of loss his family had just experienced. Instead, he was almost unnervingly calm. He said, "I don't believe this was purely analytical." I told him, "Your son stood up in a room 15 years ago and destroyed my work without evidence. I understand why you're looking for an equivalent motivation here. But everything I published was accurate, independently verified, and in the public interest. The motivation behind accurate analysis doesn't change the accuracy." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My son cost you a national competition and some scholarship offers. That's what he did." "Yes," I said. "And you cost him a business worth several $100 million. The business was built on risk that was not disclosed to investors," I said. "I disclosed it." He hung up. That was the last time I spoke to anyone in that family. I want to tell you what happened after. The firm continued growing. Ellington Analytics, by the time of the Harrington situation, had established a reputation that the quality of the Harrington call significantly enhanced. We were not the only firm that had seen the structural weakness. Other analysts had begun raising similar questions in the final months. But we had been earliest and most thorough, and the investment community has a good memory for that. Within 2 years after the collapse, we had restructured as a full analytics institution. Rather than a consulting firm, we had a data team of 40, a research staff of 22, and clients that included some of the largest institutional investors in North America. The firm was generating revenue that, in the context of my personal finances, constituted genuine wealth, not the abstract wealth of paper valuations, but real liquid capital that I could deploy however I chose. I want to be careful about how I describe what that felt like, because I think the way wealth is usually described in this kind of story is misleading. The money itself wasn't the point, and wasn't particularly satisfying in itself. What it represented was something more important. the complete resolution of the question that had been hanging over my work since a conference room in a high school in Evanston, Illinois. The question was, is the model real? The answer was yes. Not because I won, not because Trevor Harrington lost, because 37 companies over 15 years, in independent real-time predictions, had validated the methodology, because the signal I had built was genuine and had been proven genuine by the only test that matters, which is time. That was the satisfaction. The rest was aftermath. There are a few things I want to tell you about the aftermath, because this is the part of the story that I think about most. Mr. Shelton retired the spring before I turned 30. I heard about it through a former classmate who had stayed in touch with the school. I sent him a letter. Not a long one. I'm not good at long personal correspondence, but a real one, telling him what his Thursday evening conversations had meant, how his willingness to look at an unconventional high school project and take it seriously had shaped everything that came after. He wrote back 2 weeks later. He said he had followed my career from a distance and that he was glad, and that he still had the copy of my original model summary that I had shown him after school that afternoon. He had kept it, he said, because he thought it might be worth something someday. I sent him a copy of my most recent annual research publication and nothing else. That seemed right. Dr. Monroe at the university heard about the firm through academic channels and sent me a brief note congratulating me on the methodological rigor of the Harrington analysis, which he had apparently read. He noted 2 areas where he thought the modeling approach could be refined. Both notes were accurate. I implemented both refinements in the next version of the model. Curtis Monroe, who had first called me on a Tuesday afternoon in the library, had built his own career at a significant asset management firm and was by then a senior portfolio manager. We had an annual lunch, always at the same restaurant in the Loop, where we talked about the market and argued about methodology with the comfortable intensity of people who have been doing this together for a long time. He told me once that discovering my blog had been the most professionally consequential thing that had happened to him in his career, and I told him that his phone call had been the most professionally consequential thing that had happened to me in mine. Melanie left the firm to start her own legal practice about a year after the Harrington situation resolved. We are still close. She understood, I think better than I did at the time, the cost of carrying a 15-year project. She used to say, "You are the most forward-looking person I know, and also the most backward-looking, and those 2 things are at war in you constantly." She wasn't wrong. The Harrington Academy Science Conference photograph is still in my office, not displayed, not on the wall, not on the desk. It's in a drawer in the credenza behind my chair, in the same manila folder I put it in, the day I removed it from the exhibit desk before Trevor left. Sometimes I take it out when I'm alone and look at it for a moment. The boy at the podium is recognizable as me, but barely. The look on his face, I can see it even in the small resolution of a 20-year-old photograph, is the look of someone who is in the process of discovering how completely the world doesn't care about being right. I keep it because it is honest, because it tells me something true about where the work came from and what I was doing when I built it, before the work became an institution and the model became a product and the company became a brand. When it was just a notebook in my bedroom and a year and a half of afternoons, and the specific joy of building something because the problem was interesting, and the system was beautiful and the signal was real. I think about that joy more and more. Here is what I mean when I say, the victory cost something. For most of the 15 years between that conference and the Thursday morning when Trevor walked out of my office, I worked with a dual motivation. The first was the work itself, the genuine, deep-rooted love of the problem, the pleasure of building something that worked, the intellectual satisfaction of a model that kept getting better. The second was something else, something that had the shape of the photograph in the credenza drawer, something that kept asking, "Are you certain enough yet? Do you have enough proof? Is it enough yet?" I don't know exactly when the second motivation became the dominant one. I think it happened slowly, during the middle years, the years of building the company, of acquiring the positions, of writing the reports. I was so focused on the architecture of what I was building that I didn't notice how the architecture had changed in relation to its original purpose. The boy who built the first model in his bedroom did it because he had found something extraordinary, a hidden signal in financial systems that no one had thought to build exactly the way he built it, and the discovery was its own reward, independent of whether anyone ever acknowledged it. That boy was building for the love of the problem. The man who published the Harrington reports was building for something different, and the thing he was building for, when he finally achieved it, left him sitting in a very expensive office, feeling something he hadn't anticipated. Quiet, not peace, quiet. The specific silence that comes after a very long, loud argument, when the other person has left and the room has gone still, and you realize that the argument has been the organizing principle of your life for longer than you can clearly remember, and now it's over, and you have to figure out what you actually want. I had proven that the idea was stronger than the laughter. That was true. I had proven it absolutely, with data, with time, with the kind of evidence that the market itself provides, and that cannot be argued away by a confident voice in an auditorium. And it changed me. Of course it changed me. 15 years of working toward a single end, even a worthy end, even a true end, changes the shape of you. The obsessiveness that made the model great is not a costless quality. The precision that made the reports invulnerable is not free. The strategic patience that made the whole architecture possible had required me to become someone who could hold a 15-year project with complete discipline, and that kind of discipline, maintained over that kind of duration, tends to crowd out other things. I was 32 years old, and I ran a company that was advising some of the largest investment groups in the world, and I could count on one hand the people outside of work whom I talked to regularly. I had the model and the company and the proof and the credenza photograph, and I had built it all at what I was only now beginning to calculate as the actual cost. This is the strange thing I want to leave you with. I do not regret it. I want to be clear about that. I do not regret the work, the reports, the architecture of what I built, or even the Harrington analysis specifically. I believe the work was right, and I believe I did it correctly. I believe Trevor's empire should have been examined, and I believe the investors who lost money in it deserve to know what my model showed, and I believe that a 17-year-old's destroyed science project is a legitimate origin point for a career in financial risk analysis. What I regret, and this is the specific thing, the narrow, precise thing, is that somewhere in the middle of all of it, I lost the feeling I had in my bedroom with the spreadsheet and the stack of quarterly reports and the quiet, absorbed pleasure of building a system for the first time. The feeling of working on something because it was beautiful and interesting and real, with no audience, no score to settle, no one to prove anything to. I had that feeling when I was 15. I had it again, briefly, in those first Thursday afternoon sessions with Dr. Monroe's research group. I had it in occasional moments, during the early company years when the work was genuinely new, and I was figuring out how to do things I hadn't done before. I have it less now, or differently. The work is still rigorous, still satisfying in the intellectual sense, but the texture of it has changed. It has the quality of a settled thing rather than a discovered thing. And I miss the discovery. A few months ago, I started a personal project. Nothing connected to the firm. Nothing designed for any client. A new problem. I've been looking at a different class of systemic risk. Not corporate specifically, but sector-wide. A pattern in how certain industrial clusters respond to specific types of supply chain stress. Very early stage. I have a notebook, actual paper, with observations and hypotheses that are too preliminary to be dignified with the word model yet. I work on it early in the mornings, before the company demands start. Before the email, before the staff, before the clients. Just the notebook and the coffee and the specific focused silence of working on something, because the problem is interesting. And on the mornings when the thing in the notebook feels like it might actually be something, when a pattern resolves and a hypothesis strengthens, and the signal starts to emerge from the noise. On those mornings, for about 20 minutes, I feel like the kid in the bedroom again. That feeling is worth more to me now than the company, more than the proof, more than the credenza photograph and what it represents. I'm still learning what to do with that. The last thing I want to tell you is this. Trevor Harrington now works, from what I understand, in a business consulting capacity. Smaller scale, private clients, the kind of work that doesn't attract financial press or conference speaking invitations. I don't follow his career. Not because I'm avoiding it, just because there's nothing in it that my model needs to watch. He contacted my office once, about a year after the restructuring, through an intermediary. The message, relayed through Melanie, was that he wanted a conversation, not about business, or at least not ostensibly, something vague about closing a chapter. I thought about it for a day. Then I told Melanie to let him know I wasn't available. Not hostile, not rude, not explained. Just not available. No chapter to close, no conversation to have. The work had been done and the record was what it was, and there was nothing he could say that the data hadn't already said more clearly. Some people close things by talking. I close things by building. The model is still running. New companies, new signals, new predictions. The work continues because the work is never actually finished. The market keeps generating new patterns and the system keeps improving its ability to read them. And every morning there is a data set to examine and a hypothesis to test and a signal to find. That is the life I built. I won. I know I won. I'm still figuring out what that means for the rest of it. And on the mornings with the new notebook, when the problem opens up and the pattern starts to move, I think maybe I'm getting closer to an answer. Not the kind of answer that goes in a report or validates a model or proves anything to anyone. Just the kind of answer that's true. That's enough. That's more than enough. And I want to ask you one more time, before you go, if you had spent 15 years building toward a moment, if you had put everything you had into proving something that had been taken from you, and then the moment came and resolved exactly the way you designed it, and you sat in the quiet afterward and realized that the building had changed you more than the moment had, would you do it again? Would the proof have been worth the price? Put that in the comments. I genuinely want to know, because I've been asking myself that question since October, sitting in my office with the city outside the window and a notebook in a drawer, and the very strange feeling of a man who finally arrived somewhere and is only now beginning to understand where he was trying to go. The signal was real. I am 34 years old now. I run a company. I have the photograph and the credenza and the new notebook on the corner of my desk and the model running on servers I own in a building I lease in a city that doesn't remember the quiet kid from Evanston and never needed to. Some mornings I take the train to work the same way I took the train to the Grayson Capital meeting at 21, and I watch the city go past the window, and I think about the specific sequence of things that had to happen, the choices I made right, and the choices I made wrong, and the years of work, and the years of patience, and the one conversation in one office, on one October morning, that produced the person sitting in that train seat, looking at Chicago. It is an unusual feeling, not pride exactly, more like the feeling of looking at a very complex proof and understanding every step of the derivation, and knowing that it was hard, and that it holds. The signal was real. I built something that proved it. And I am still, even now, learning what else I might build. Not to prove anything, but simply because the problems are interesting, and the systems are beautiful, and the signals, if you look carefully enough and build patiently enough, and hold the question long enough without flinching, are always there, waiting to be found.